Hello everyone, thanks for joining today. Thanks for inviting me as well to hold this webinar today. I will start sharing my screen. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about people and carnivores, and as Orjan said, I also work on interdisciplinary, looking at people and wildlife more in general terms. So some of the projects I'll be talking about today are not specifically targeted towards carnivores, but I think we can still draw parallel learnings from that. So I will talk a little bit about perceptions of carnivore management interventions in Sweden specifically. This is what I did for my PhD, but I will also talk a little bit more theoretically about these human-wildlife conflicts from the perspective of the individual person. And I'm currently based at Lund University, but I have been working at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences for many years, and still work in collaboration. So some of the work is done in each respective university. But currently I'm based at the environmental psychology group in Lund University, although my background is in biology. So I thought I'd start a little bit with some background about large carnivores in Sweden, since I didn't know quite how familiar you are with the large carnivores in Sweden situation, and then talk a little bit about human-wildlife conflicts from the individual's perspective, and tie this to perceptions of large carnivore management interventions in Sweden that I did for my PhD. So the large carnivores in Sweden have been bounty hunted in the past. So it's the wolves were pretty much extinct in the mid-20th century, whereas brown bears, lynx and wolverines were very close to extinction. And at this point, when they were at very low numbers, the species became protected at various points during the century, and the populations have since recovered. These are not the very latest estimates, but they're very similar to the estimates of today. We have brown bears in most part of the northern half of the country. We've got lynx that occur throughout the country. The wolf population, although wolves can occur throughout the country, the main population and the breeding population is sort of dispersed in the south central parts of the country. And wolverines occur in the northwestern part of the country, which is the mountainous areas. And there are, of course, people living in this region as well. And with people come domestic animals. So in the northern half of the country, we've got reindeer herding. And reindeer are kept as semi-domestic animals that roam freely in the landscape. In the sort of northwestern areas, there are also some traditional transhumance farms that keep their animals free-ranging in the forest during the summer, but bring them back to the farm in the winter. And then we have hunting dogs as well as pet dogs that are occurring all over the country, of course. And sheep farms are mainly distributed in the southern part of the country. And sheep are usually kept fenced in farms. And when carnivores and domestic animals interact, sometimes the domestic animals can get injured or killed by the carnivores, and around 50 dogs on average get killed by large carnivores each year, and around 500 or so livestock get killed by large carnivores each year, and this is mainly sheep. And the reindeer are not included in this graph, I should say, because in the reindeer herding area, the reindeer are the main prey species for the large carnivores, and therefore there is an estimated 25 to 50,000 reindeer that get killed by the large carnivores each year. So the losses are pretty high when it comes to reindeer losses. People, of course, interact with large carnivores as well, or experience their presence. This graph is taken from Sabrina Dressel and colleagues' work. It's a recent report where they looked at attitudes towards large carnivores in Sweden. and they asked people what their view is on the fact that bears, wolverines, lynx, wolves, and golden eagles exist in Sweden. And as you can see from the graphs, the light green bars are respondents that have told that they like very much that these animals exist in Sweden. But as you can also see, the more dark green bars, there are also people who strongly dislike that these animals occur. And this is perhaps particularly pronounced for the wolf. And of course, so then you get these two sort of polarized or opposite views on the carnivore's existence, which could be a potential for conflict, for social conflicts around these animals' presence, because people have very strongly held views on the existence of these species. And that leads me on to these human-wildlife conflicts, because you're probably very familiar with this terminology, human-wildlife conflicts. It's if we look at the scientific literature, it's been a criticized terminology, partly because it's too narrow to capture all the different types of interactions that occur when humans and wildlife share the landscapes. So it only focuses on the negative interactions, and these are both interactions with humans and wildlife, but also between humans about wildlife. And therefore, the concept of the terminology has also been criticized for being too broad to actually allow a targeted action to deal with these situations that we refer to as human-wildlife conflicts. Because we need to know what we're dealing with, if it's social conflicts or negative impacts that wildlife and people have on one another, in order to target them and do something about them. And we wanted to look at this a little bit further from an environmental psychology perspective. So the work I'm doing currently is based in environmental psychology. And this subject or research field is looking at human relationships, the individual's relationship with his or her ambient environment. So this can be a physical environment, including wild animals, so the environment that you're active in or live in, and the elements in this environment that you interact with. But it can also be a social environment, so the people you interact with in your life. And the theories that are employed in environmental psychology are aiming to understand processes behind emotional and behavioral reactions. So rather than just saying that, okay, we have negative attitudes or positive attitudes towards something, or we act with impact on wildlife or not, we try to understand the reasons why, the reasons behind these expressions or reactions. And we think that can be really useful to generate sort of an empathic dialogue around wildlife and wildlife management and conservation. So we did a literature review on human-wildlife conflict to try and see what types of human-wildlife interactions and human-human interactions are currently described in the scientific literature, and which groups, which individuals are depicted as actors within human-wildlife conflict situations. And then we wanted to use this literature to illustrate and discuss how these human-wildlife conflict situations can be understood from an individual appraisal of a situation. So I will come to that shortly. So we did a search in Scopus and Web of Science in May 2021, and we only included the very most recent literature because it's a vast amount of literature on human-wildlife conflict. and we wanted to limit our search somewhat. And I'm not going to go into the details about the screening, but we used 182 papers that were referring to human-wildlife conflicts for the analysis and discussion. And these studies were done all over the globe, basically, but most studies were done in Africa and Asia. And the objects, as we would call it, that were described in these studies related to various different wildlife, sometimes several different species, but there was a large focus on large charismatic wildlife, such as elephants or the large carnivores, to some extent also primates and birds. And the objects that there was an impact on, that was mainly relating to livestock and crops. And in this pie chart, I tried to illustrate the number of papers that deal with different aspects of this broader concept of human-wildlife conflict. The majority of papers, the blue pie slice, is actually referring to wildlife impacts on human property, such as livestock and crops. The vast majority of papers are actually dealing with wildlife damages and estimating wildlife damages, but refer to this as human-wildlife conflict. There are also some papers, the green slices, that are looking more at human impacts on wildlife, and this can be through illegal hunting, for instance. But human-wildlife conflicts as a broad concept is of course, more complex than that. And this is also illustrated in the literature. Some papers are dealing with these more social conflicts. And these papers are either dealing with contrasting views within a certain group, and with a certain group, I also include members of the public in a certain population, for instance. There can also be contrasted views between different groups, such as different interest groups, or between different populations, an urban and a rural population, for instance. And then there are some studies in which one specific actor, that is the focus of the study, expresses views on another actor. So basically, the current use of human-wildlife conflict in the scientific literature seems to be describing impacts that people and wildlife have on each other, and or social conflicts, sometimes intermixed and sometimes separated. But we want to look at how we can understand the processes behind the attitudes and behaviors that people show that lead to these social conflicts, the papers that dealt with the social interactions. And first of all, we ask ourselves which actors are described in this literature, and to a large extent the focus is on locals, we call it. These can be local communities that live close to protected areas, for instance, or more specific interest groups such as farmers, landowners, animal owners, or fishermen. And these groups are contrasted with the authorities, such as park authorities, conservationists, wildlife managers, even the state, or contrasted with members of the public, tourists, or animal rights activists. So it's the actors are depicted sort of in contrast with each other, but the papers take a fairly one-sided focus from, I would say, a conservation and management perspective. So we're interested in I guess when we're working with conservation and wildlife management, we also want to see what are the consequences that this can have for other people in this local region, for example. And therefore, the interests come from this side, potentially. So that there seems to be a fairly one-sided focus like that. And these papers describe various reactions. It can be attitudes or emotions. But as I've already stated, we want to understand the process behind these reactions in order to be able to address them. So I'm going to discuss this from our theoretical models that we use in environmental psychology to try and describe the situation from the individual's perspective. And we use these models in various different contexts, so not necessarily only focusing on wildlife. This is a model that we call the human environment interaction model, to give that gives sort of an overview on the different aspects of the environment that the person is interacting with and how. So first of all, in these papers that we've been reviewing, it seems that the actors are very much defined in this particular context by their activity. So in the local context, on the left, the individuals are described as farmers or fishermen, etc. So very much defined by these farming activities, animal ownership, or fishing that they are undertaking. On the other hand, we have conservationists, wildlife tourists, and others. They are defined by their activity that relates very much to the wildlife. Conserving wildlife or viewing wildlife, etc. Although the actors are defined by their activity to a great extent, they likely have various different goals with these activities. And I think that's important to remember when we work in conservation or wildlife management, that there might be an obvious goal of doing an activity such as an economic goal to earn a living or livelihood, but there might very well be many other goals that people have with choosing a specific activity also for their livelihood. So it can be to preserve a cultural heritage or maintaining a landscape or many other things. So this might be very individual. The people then, these individuals who are undertaking an activity, they do this in a context of a physical environment. And for the local actor, the wild animals become part of the physical environment in which they are keeping their livestock or fishing, etc. And the wild animals in the context of human-wildlife conflicts can, of course, have an impact on the activities. Vice versa, the conservationist or wildlife tourist will be undertaking his or her activity in a physical environment that includes the livestock and the fishing gear and the agricultural fields, etc., that the local community, which is part of the local community activities. So for this reason, these two actors become part of one another's social environment. So they're also having a relationship with one another because of sharing this landscape. The physical environment and the social environment and the situations that occur is then appraised, and I will go a little bit more into detail what I mean with appraising the environment shortly. But these environmental stimulus are appraised by the individual in relation to the goals and activities that the person has and the individual resources that the person has to deal with the situation. And individual resources can be tangible or intangible resources. It can be money and time, but it could also be, for instance, personality traits or knowledge and such things. So we all have different resources with us when we deal with the world around us. And the appraisal process in more detail has been described in many different ways, but we quite often use the component process model in my work, which suggests that when a person interacts with any event or a stimulus in the environment, this event or stimulus is appraised first of all for its relevance. Is it relevant to me? Does it matter at all to me? And if it is relevant, what implications might it have? So what does it mean to me? Does it have any consequences for me and for my goals and activities? And if it does have consequences, can I cope with this? Can I handle the situation? And finally, is it congruent with the individual norms? So is it in line with what I think is right or wrong, and how I think the world should be? So this occurs very quickly, of course, and subconsciously sometimes. So it's not necessarily something that takes a very long time, but it occurs quickly and results in an emotional reaction or a behavioral reaction to the stimulus. So when our individuals in this larger model appraise these physical and social environments and the situation they are in, they will react with an emotional or behavioral reaction to the situation. And in this context of human-wildlife conflicts, sometimes these expressions are very strong and of strong emotional character, such as hatred. We found examples of that in the literature we were reviewing. So people expressing hatred towards one another, actually. So one line of thought or idea that we often see in on the biology or ecology side to try and deal with these situations as a whole is to prevent the impact, of course, that the wild animals such as carnivores, so now I'm going to talk more specifically about carnivores, that the carnivores have on the activities that local people are undertaking in the area where the carnivores occur. Perhaps with the hope that this will also mitigate the conflicts that occur, because if there would be less negative impacts from the carnivores, there would be less negative reactions and hence potentially then less negative social interactions as well. So there are various different interventions around in Sweden, as well as in many other parts of the world, of course. These are some examples of interventions that are sometimes discussed, such as livestock guarding dogs, carnivore deterring fences that are kept around the fields where grazing animals are kept, culling of carnivores or hunting carnivores, fladry, that's like cloth flags on strings that should scare off carnivores from grazing animals, light and sound deterrents, livestock guarding llamas. And then we have for hunting dogs, quite often different types of protective vests are discussed. In this picture, it's an electric vest that gives an electric shock if this dog would be bitten across its back. So there are various different interventions around that are discussed. And in my PhD work, I wanted to understand what people who were intended to be using these interventions, what they thought about it, whether they would accept or oppose using these interventions. So this picture is showing a graph from a survey that was sent to hunters with dogs in Sweden a few years back. On the y-axis, you have the oppose accept measures. So going from oppose to accept, the higher up each of these bubbles in the graph are, the more acceptable they are to these respondents. On the x-axis, we have the believed effectiveness that the respondents have have responded to regarding all these interventions. And each of the bubble in the graph is one specific intervention that we've asked them about. The size of the bubble represents the variation in the responses. So the larger the bubble, the more variation there is in the responses. If only a believed effect was determining whether a person would want to use an intervention or not, if that was the only reason for why people want to use interventions, then we would expect that there would be a sort of one-to-one relationship between believed effect and acceptance for using these interventions. And this is true for some of the interventions. So for hunters with dogs, they were fairly positive and accepting of different types of hunting of carnivores, such as removing a certain proportion of the carnivore population, or keeping the carnivores in a zoning area, or removing problem individuals. These were believed to be effective interventions, and they were also accepted by the hunters. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we have the wolf deterring bell at the very left. This intervention was believed to be counterproductive, and it was also opposed by the hunters to use. So for some interventions, this seems to fit fairly well. But there are also some interventions that are believed to be quite effective, and yet they are not really accepted by these hunters with dogs. And these are, for instance, the different protective vests, such as vest with spikes or electric vest. These are believed to be almost as effective as removing carnivores, but they are not quite as acceptable to these users of the interventions. So there is something more than just believing an intervention is effective to be able to use it, it seems. The pattern is similar for sheep owners. Sheep owners are very positive to or accepting of using carnivore deterring fences, and they were also positive to different types of removal of the carnivores. But the interventions they also thought were really efficient or effective to reduce the risk of carnivore attacks, such as night shelters and livestock guarding dogs. These were very much less accepted by the sheep owners on average, I should say. So they're probably very accepted by some, but not by others. So in order to understand better why this is the case, why people want to use or not want to use an intervention, we also did interviews with animal owners. So we interviewed sheep owners, hunters with dogs, also reindeer herders, transhumans, farmers, and pet dog owners. And all these animal owners that were interviewed in several focus group discussions. So we got perspectives from many participants. All these animal owners thought that the large carnivores were a relevant threat to their animals. That could potentially have large implications because they could kill or injure the animals. But it differed a little bit when it came to their ability to cope with this threat. So the pet dog owners seemed fairly able to cope with this. They kept their pet dogs on a leash, and then the problem was very much reduced. But for the other groups, these different interventions might be one way of dealing with this situation to be able to cope. Because if people aren't able to cope with this threat, then the threat of the large carnivores can generate a lot of worry and anxiety amongst these animal owners. So we proposed various different interventions to these animal owners, but of course, implementing an intervention also means another thing in your environment that you are interacting with. So the intervention itself starts another appraisal process. So first of all, the interventions are appraised for their relevance. This relates partly to the functionality or the effectiveness of the intervention. One transhumance farmer said that a lot more research is needed. How can you say yes to using an intervention when we don't know the results of the research? Another aspect of the relevance relates to the threat intensity. So if you remember, I told you about the reindeer herding area. The reindeer are the main prey species for the large carnivores. And that means the threat intensity is very high. So when we ask reindeer herders about scaring off carnivores or some sort of hazing, one reindeer herder said that if you manage to scare off a carnivore, it still knows. The carnivore knows where the food is and will shortly come back. He wants to have food too. Finally, if an intervention is to be relevant for the animal owners, it needs to be feasible to implement. If it can't be used in their everyday life, then it's impossible to use it, of course. In the next step, the interventions are praised for their implications that they might have, either to the animal owner, him or herself, but also to other people and animal welfare. And to some extent, these implications or consequences are weighed towards the relevance of the intervention. So, for instance, when it comes to the price, some of these interventions are fairly pricey. And one hunter said about purchasing an electric vest that if I knew that it worked and that it protected my dog, then the price wouldn't bother me. But if you don't know if it works, then the price bothers. So this person had not bought a vest yet. And also there are animal welfare concerns. These relate to all different animal species, to sheep in keeping sheep indoors, as well as putting vests on hunting dogs that get really warm and overheat, etc. But as an example, here I put a reindeer herder who was talking about keeping reindeer in an enclosure. This person said that diseases can bring down a reindeer herd in no time if it's kept in an enclosure and if bad luck strikes. Finally, then, the animal owners must be able to deal with these consequences, to cope with these implications if they're going to be able to use them. And coping can be done, coping can be within the person, so your own individual resources that you have to deal with a situation, but it can also be an interpersonal coping where you get help from others, such as your peers or even the authorities. So this is where perhaps carnivore management can come in and provide support for animal owners. As an example here, a hunter with dog who was tracking an area in the snow to see that there were no wolves around in the area before releasing their dogs, said that you don't have to drive until you drop. Well, it becomes a lot of miles, so it does, but you have so much support from other people, like there is a collaboration around it. So in this hunting team, they had a sort of collaboration that facilitated this sort of interpersonal coping with the consequences. Another a sheep owner talked about receiving help from the authorities to clear grass under the carnivore deterring fences. These are fences with live wires, so 5 live wires, and you need to clear the grass frequently to keep it functional. And this is a lot of work for the sheep owners that have large fields. So one sheep owner was very pleased with the authorities sending people to clear the grass. And she said that the summer before last, we received help. It was great. It was splendid because we have shitloads of fences and there were loads of them and they just whoosh and it was great. So the grass just cleared, and they didn't have to do put in all this work and time for clearing the grass themselves. So it worked. Otherwise, they would not have time to maintain the fences. But sometimes it also goes wrong, and people aren't able to cope with the consequences of an intervention. Another sheep owner was given these light and sound deterrents that set off if there is movement. One sheep owner, this sheep owner said that the screaming is really loud and high pitched, and as there are two different noises, and because I work the shifts, I couldn't stand it. I got nervous tendencies in the midst of everything, so these are going down. She couldn't cope with this, getting woken up by these sound devices all the time. So just because it's functional, if we can't cope with the implications the interventions have, it's going to be really difficult to use them. Finally, the interventions must be in line with what a person thinks is right and wrong and ethically correct in this world. And as an example, I provided two sheep owners that were talking about livestock guarding dogs. Dogs are usually in Sweden kept as family members or as companion animals that come inside the houses. And one sheep owner said that you can't keep dogs like that in our country purely ethically, to keep the livestock guarding dog out with the sheep. Another one said, for me personally, it would be really difficult because that dog would end up inside in the bed, which is not the intention of a livestock guarding dog, of course, since it should be with the sheep. So for these two sheep owners, it wouldn't be possible to keep a dog like that. So to sum up, if interventions are believed to be relevant, if they don't have any implications, or if people are at least able to cope with the implications that they have, and if the interventions are congruent with the norms that people hold, then they can be really effective to reduce the levels of worry that we experience regarding the large carnivores. But if we present or propose interventions to animal owners that they think are irrelevant, or which have implications with which they cannot cope, or that are completely incongruent with their norms, then actually proposing and pushing for these interventions might just increase frustration. So there were a fair number of expressions about frustration during these interviews as well. So to prevent or manage and mediate both impacts and conflicts, perhaps, we need to have a good dialogue between the different actors, and aim to be empathic in this conversation. And to achieve this, we all need to be able to recognize our own role, but also be willing to listen to the other party, of course, to try and understand and appraise the other person's situation. And in a paper which is we have submitted, we'll see where it ends up. We're suggesting that this dialogue may benefit if the involved actors would clarify their goals and activities. Well, clarify not least to ourselves what goals and activities each of the actors have in the situation, what implications that the situation, including both the physical as well as the social environment, can have for the goals and activities that each of the actor has. Also be able to express the coping potential that each of the actors have with regards to dealing with this situation and the implications it has. And finally, what do different actors see as a correct way of managing the situation, both with the wild animals, but also between other actors. So this can be between conservation actors and local actors or others. So trying to keep this in mind when we talk to people might be useful to try and disentangle where these strong emotions and attitudes come from. So that was all that I wanted to share today. So I hope that's been interesting for you. And I think I will stop sharing my screen then.
Thank you, Ann. Really interesting. Even for me, who are from Sweden, and I'm sure many of them from the audience who is not as familiar with our system. But so yes, do please type in questions in the in the chat. It is quite interesting to see that. I think it's kind of universal that the wolf is the most disliked of the carnivores. I think it's the same throughout Central Asia too. They have a hard time.
Yeah. There is a question about electric vest and spike interventions that I might respond to. I can see in the chat.
Oh yes, please.
Yeah. And I think these vests, it's basically different companies, I think mainly in Sweden at least, that have been trying to find interventions that would prevent particularly wolf attacks on hunting dogs, because hunting dogs are used. We have in Sweden, usually hunting dogs are released as loose hunting dogs. They go out and track and search for the hunted wildlife, the game species. And of course, if you are in an area where wolves occur, the hunting dog might then interact with wolves, and there is a risk that it might get attacked. So the idea about these vests is to basically have a barrier that prevents a lethal bite on the dog. So the spikes, of course, would, be if a wolf would bite that, it would really hurt the wolf to bite it. With the electric vest, it emits an electric shock if a wolf bites, so almost like biting an electric fence, I think. So that's the idea of them. And some people, I think quite a few people use them. For some, it's more difficult because if you hunt early in the season when the weather is still warm, it can make the dog really hot to wear a vest because you don't get any circulation in the fur of the hunting dog when it's running. So it can make the dog hot, and it can also make the dog a bit less mobile because it's an extra weight it has to carry, and at least the spike vest is quite stiff to prevent the lethal bites. So some people are skeptical for animal welfare reasons, for the dog's sake.
Do you think they could work on other animals too, like horses or something?
The vests?
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, there are interventions around that specifically in areas where there are big cats. So I guess that would be the what you see quite a lot. That there are interventions suggested that would at least be a barrier around the neck. So you keep a collar on your sheep, for example, because the idea is that the cats quite often bite around the neck, right? Or on the throat. So to protect that throat bite, you would put like a barrier. So that could be I've seen spike collars, and there are also collars that are just very hard material that they can't penetrate. When we've asked sheep owners in Sweden about this, their concern has been, well, first of all, that this prevents bites from cats potentially. So if you have problems with wolves, it's pointless. Another thing they are a bit concerned about is that their sheep can go outside and get caught in in these collars. So if they, because the sheep owners say their sheep just go out in their fields and maybe their forest and bushes and stuff, and they seem to at least some remark that the sheep might not always be walking very smoothly as we would like them to with these collars. So they might go and get caught up and die because they get caught in the collar. So it's also, again, animal welfare concerns. With horses, I don't know. I mean, I guess like places like Spain where wolves do attack horses to a greater extent than in Sweden. I'm not quite sure how they would bite or drag down the horse. I think to some extent, if it's for wolves, I don't think they would bite a horse across the back. They would probably bite the snout or try and pull them down, biting their legs. So putting an electric vest or coat on a horse might not be so useful. Because as the dog is smaller than the wolf, it would be more likely it bites across the back, I guess.
Yeah. And maybe with cats then, we can something to think about at least.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question from Rashmi Singh Rana. Hi, thanks for the lovely presentation. I was wondering if there has been any monitoring exercise or documentation done on the impacts, particularly negative impacts, of guard dogs on wild animals like wolves, bears, etc., other than just preventing these wild predators from predating on livestock?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There have been, I think. We didn't look for that particularly in this review, but I have seen before that there are studies that have looked at their impact on at least mesopredators, so foxes and other species. So I think there might be the livestock guarding dogs are quite popular, I think, in the scientific literature to be evaluated for different reasons. So I think it would be possible to find these sort of studies that look at the negative impacts on wild animals. I'm not sure if it's going to be particularly on wolves and bears, because I'm unsure about if there are any. Because I assume we're talking about negative impact, so if they would injure the wolves and bears or something like that. And I am a little bit unsure about that. But for mesopredators, I think you would be able to find these studies at least. But we are, I could mention that as well, because that might be interesting in this context. We have been working on this for a long time and it's been very slow. So I was going to include it in my presentation, but then I got the time wrong. So, but we are working on a website or a web portal where we want to try and communicate these sort of this sort of research regarding interventions and their effectiveness and potentially also the impacts and negative or positive as well evaluations of interventions, which we call EviWild. I started it up many years ago, but then we haven't had funding to do any reviews to fill it with information. But it seems like we're going to pick up this work again next year, hopefully, to try and provide a portal which is open online to try and communicate the research evaluations of these interventions to anyone who's interested. So practitioners or people who want to use interventions or researchers for that matter. So maybe I can come back on that question.
Yeah, that would be perfect. And we could maybe put a link to the portal on our snow leopard networks?
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Yeah. I think you could probably, I mean, if you would be interested in these sort of questions, I'm sure we'd be happy to have input about it as well, to make it user-friendly and to make it useful. That's the whole point of it. So the website is up. I can share it with you later if you want to share it, but of course it's not much information on it yet, so it's, yeah, we'll see. I think there is, did you
sorry, I can read it.
Yes, go ahead.
Did you find that different actors had different views on defining an impact, given you used acceptability versus perceived impact?
Let me think. We didn't know. I don't think we looked at that in. I'm trying to go back now with interviews and things where we looked at, because this is basically when we do a quantitative survey, it's basically us that define what we're asking about, right? So we're not asking people to provide input on their definitions. So basically, the different actors and definitions that would be from our interviews in that context. I don't think there was exactly any particular. I haven't looked at the data in that way, but I don't. Spontaneously, I don't think there was any specific definitions of these impacts. I think in general, speaking of wildlife conflicts, wildlife impacts, at least the interviews that I've had with animal owners, for instance, is that we're talking about this as a big blur, almost like that's kind of where this literature review project came from as well. We're talking about these human wildlife conflicts, but one person is talking about, we say conflict, but some people are talking about the negative impacts that the carnivores have on ourselves and on our livestock. Someone else is talking about the impacts that we have on the carnivores, and another person is talking about social conflicts. And all of these different impacts and conflicts do occur, but it's talked about in a very sort of tangled up concept, I think, where it becomes difficult to disentangle where the problem is. I mean, the problem can be in different places. So, but that's kind of why we wanted to try and disentangle this, to try and explain the situations with the separate actors and with how we interact both with the animals, but also with each other, and trying to disentangle and understand these situations in that way. But I used acceptability and perceived impact. The acceptability is an attitude measure in our case, mainly. So are you evaluating this as a positive or negative action to take? So it's kind of an acceptability measure. Perceived impact would be how people experience. Would they experience an impact from the carnivores? But I don't think I used them together. I think I get a bit uncertain now. But we combine them with a believed effectiveness of the interventions anyway, to see if that related to the acceptability.
Yeah. I was wondering have you looked at differences in perception of people or stakeholders in areas that has had carnivores for a long time versus areas where they've just colonized or settled, if they are more or less accepting?
We've not made any quantitative comparisons as such with this data. But the interviews were done in different areas. So we had with the sheep owners, for instance, we interviewed sheep owners in 3 different regions, 2 which had a long presence of wolves and lynx, and 1 area in which wolves only sporadically occur. Although that has not been part of the analysis, my impression, at least, is that people seemed almost more worried in the regions where wolves sporadically occurred than in the regions where people were sort of used to living with the wolves. Of course, the people who lived in the areas where wolves occurred more long-term and in a larger density as well, they were worried for the safety of their animals, and they were worried about what they would find in the morning when they got out to check on their animals, etc. But in some way, they were experienced with dealing with it as well, and with the communication with the authorities as well. So an impression I got then was that the people who did not have this experience might be a little bit more concerned with it, but that's not something we have analyzed in detail.
Let's see. Here's a question. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'm curious about if it is possible to change people's behaviors. For example, persuade them to use certain methods to avoid conflicts with carnivores through nudge methods. For example, telling their neighbors are using these methods.
Well, I think, again, I think it's really important, going back to the presentation, I think it's really important to listen to these people. So if we're interacting with a person that we as conservationists or as wildlife managers think would benefit from using a specific intervention, it's really not, I think, for us to decide whether this will be possible for the person or not. But if we are willing to listen to the person, to hear what the person is concerned about, what interventions would be relevant for this person, so which ones are feasible to implement, what are the implications that they are concerned about, and why or why not are they able to cope with these implications, and what do they think is acceptable to do. I still think that's really important, that we're listening in and trying to communicate this clearly, and not trying to persuade or manipulate people's behavior without them being comfortable about it. Then when it comes to nudging, I'm not very like, I've not worked with this sort of nudging, but if we talk about it in a way of facilitating coping, for example, so say that a person doesn't have the financial resources to buy an intervention or to undertake an intervention, if that's the barrier to act, then maybe we can help facilitate this if we come from a conservation organization that has a little bit of funding to help this. So I think it's better to see it that way. I don't think we should, I mean, like now, I don't know, in this example, maybe the neighbor is using a method. So yes, in that case, of course, you can say that other people are using a method, but I don't think that trying to persuade people as such might be the way forward, but rather listen in and trying to find a shared way forward where we try to support people in doing things that they would actually that would be acceptable to them anyway. But as I said, if we can identify what the barriers are, if these are financial or if it's like the method itself, maybe we can find other interventions that would work better and such.
And yeah, this is the comment. You fear what you don't know more, perhaps. This is often the case with humans. And yeah, I agree with that in relation to areas where carnivores settle in.
Yeah, because I think maybe it relates a little bit to some sort of psychological distance we have to things as well. Things that we know very well, we know what the consequences are, and we know we learn how to deal with it, perhaps. But things that are more abstract and hypothetical, we can either look at them very, very positively and make a really nice picture, or a horror story, because we have to imagine what the situation will be like.
Hi, Anne. I just had a quick question. We often, many teams often want to evaluate their programs and so on. And, your study is an in-depth literature review, but also in-depth assessment of some of the programs. I was wondering what recommendations you have for practitioners in terms of assessing programs on the ground that, might not have the time, or, maybe it is that they need to make time and need to get many experts on board as well. But if you had some practical recommendations for practitioners on evaluating interventions.
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a big question. I think with evaluations of these interventions, I think it's a really good thing would be to actually make sure we have these sort of transdisciplinary collaborations already to start with, because when we've I didn't present it here, but we've also done literature review on the effectiveness of these interventions in preventing carnivore attacks on livestock, which is getting a bit dated now, but it was a broader review, and I think what people often struggle with, because this is an ongoing work, is that we quite often come in maybe afterwards. So you implement an intervention and then you don't really have a control to compare with. And I think if we try to establish, if possible, if practitioners are working with this, if we can, and as researchers, we should try and meet each other and find each other beforehand, so we can measure or at least collect some data on if it's livestock losses we want to evaluate, that we can measure this beforehand and then implement the intervention in a somewhat structured way that allows evaluation. But it is a fairly long-term work, and it's not super easy, but I think that we're going to see more and more of these sort of transdisciplinary collaborations between researchers and practitioners working together to evaluate how effective our interventions are. And then personally, I think it's also really important to, in parallel with these evaluations, actually evaluating the programs from a social perspective as well, to see people who are involved in these programs, how do they react to these programs, how do they perceive it, and how does that help their coping, and where does the program take them as well. I think that would be really useful. Or otherwise, you're also very welcome to get in touch. If you don't remember my email, you can probably pass it forward through the network. At least someone can get hold of me somewhere.
Yes,
hopefully.
Absolutely.
And I'd be very happy to get back to you in a year or so if we manage to work on this intervention web portal as well. I'm really excited about that web portal. So if we get it up and running a little bit better, I would very much like to share it with you as well.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Really nice. Perfect. And yeah, if you do want to get in touch with Ann, do write to Raki and she'll manage. And Olivia says, thank you for the great talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks for joining from at many awkward times of the day and night, I think it seems. So
It's a very
thanks.
international group. No, but thank you, Ann.
Yes.
It was very nice. Very
Thank you
interesting
very much.